welcome to Daily Debrief brought to you by People's Dispatch. Tensions are high in East Asia as US House of Representatives Speaker Nancy Pelosi is on a tour of Southeast Asia with a plan to land in Taiwan. China has strongly opposed the plan and has threatened strong action. We have with us Prashant for more on this. So Prashant, this is a developing story, but can you tell us what we have so far?
Right. So this is again, like you said, it's developing in the sense that Nancy Pelosi is on her way. It's very unclear what her itinerary is. She, of course, plans to visit certain key allies in the region, Japan, Singapore, for instance. But the big question is, will she want to land in Taiwan? Now, this is this is it's very fraught with danger. I think, in fact, there is a lot of underestimation of how risky it is because China has made it very clear that it will not welcome such a gesture. Now, Nancy Pelosi is a high-ranking U.S. official. She's the Speaker of the House of Representatives, which means she's third in line in terms of success, second in line in terms of succession if anything happens to Joe Biden, for instance, which means the U.S. government is obligated to also give her a particular kind of protection. Now, keeping that in mind, the situation is right now very, very tense. Now, it's a larger question as to why Nancy Pelosi is doing it. There are multiple factors involved, of course, but one key aspect is that to be remembered is that the US media has carried reports which says that both the Pentagon and the Joe Biden administration both have were discouraging her in recent days from making this visit, considering the nature of tensions globally right now, right? And nonetheless, of course, she has not confirmed whether she is going to land or not, because that, of course, would, in some senses, what she plans is if she intends to land, it's going to be a surprise landing. But what this has really done is raise the pitch of raise tensions really to a very high pitch. We know that Joe Biden and Xi Jinping had a telephonic conversation on Thursday. This issue did come up. Xi Jinping delivered a very categorical warning in terms of saying that, those who play with fire, for instance, will suffer the consequences, talked about red lines. All these are, very clear in terms of China taking a very clear stand on this. Now, we, of course, know that the United States is also formally committed to the One China policy. That has been its, intention, or that has been its proclamation all along. Now, this has not stopped the fact that the United States has continued to supply arms to Taiwan. In fact, there have been many recent provocations on that front. Also, we know, for instance, that there's arms supplies worth more than $100 million in the pipeline, which the US has said they will continue to proceed. There is a bill which talks about $4.5 billion worth of military assistance over the next 4 years, along with treating Taiwan as a non-NATO ally, all of which is really yet, are more signs of escalation from the side of the US. And of course, China at this point, which is also going through a delicate political situation, has in some senses, they are also being in some sense pushed to a corner in terms of these are responses they might have to take very strongly. So altogether, a very difficult time for people across the world, because we know both of them are nuclear powers. We know that both of them have very strong militaries. So at this point, one can only really hope that wiser sense prevails. There is no scope for a military escalation, and the rest, and that the diplomatic channels, the way that various channels are there, the kind of discussions between diplomats that take place between the highest levels of government might somehow, make sure that no confrontation takes place. But yes, a very difficult time.
Yeah, Prashant, the question remains, but why is US taking such a provocative way ahead?
Right, so there are multiple points. One is that, of course, US-China relations have gone through a lot of ups and downs in recent times. A key moment has been that of the time period of Donald Trump, during which point, there were a very strong set of sanctions were levied. China was very clearly identified as a rival that had to be brought down or suppressed in various ways. There was this larger encirclement of China that was attempted. Now, Joe Biden came to power promising a different approach. But in practice, what has happened is a continuation of the same approach. We see that, for instance, in the recent NATO declaration that came out, which specifically took China by name and identified it as a country to watch out for. We see that, for instance, in operations such as the Quad, or which is basically also meant in some senses, or for that matter, AUKUS, which is definitely meant to sort of encircle China. So keeping all this in mind, this is a larger, larger trend in US strategy, which really does not depend really on parties or the exact president in power, but a larger trend of the US establishment itself. Now, the key point, of course, is that China is growing at a very fast rate. It has developed its own relations with many countries across the world, which are independent of which are independent, which have a particular vision, etc. And the United States sees is on the other hand is going through a massive economic crisis, which we'll talk about later. But what the US sees is that China emerging in every sense of the term as a global competitor for the United States. And at this point, its only the option that the US has chosen at this point is to raise temperatures as much as possible in order to prevent that kind of Chinese growth, so to speak. For instance, when you raise those kind of temperatures, maybe countries might think twice before establishing relationships with China on the one hand, or the fact that, say, China's own internal economy, for instance, starts suffering because of sanctions, because of that kind of threat perception. So that's one aspect of it, definitely. So that is a larger, sort of framework in which many of these actions are taking place. Now, within that, there are, of course, again, ups and downs. We know, for instance, that recently Joe Biden publicly said that the US would defend Taiwan in case of a Chinese invasion. And then the US officials walked back from that stance, saying that no, that's not exactly what happened, etc., etc. So, keeping all this in mind, what we have is this is a larger framework, this larger notion of encirclement to deal with China's competition, because the US economically is definitely not able to compete with China anymore, and that is a fact. Whereas militarily, it still retains its edge over China, and it's trying to leverage that military edge, as well as its hold over institutions, its hold over certain alliances it has, to sort of make up for that edge that it has lost. So that's, of course, the larger context. Within that, of course, acts like these are of course much more smaller actions, but which could spark anything for all you know. So that they are extremely dangerous at this point of time in the context of that larger tension.
Thank you so much for that update, Prashant. Our second story is from Iraq, where supporters of Shia cleric Moqtada al Sadr stormed parliament for the second time in a week. The protesters are against the nomination of Mohammed Shia al Sudani as prime minister. Iraq is facing a political crisis after al Sadr supporters, who were the largest bloc in parliament, resigned after a government could not be formed according to his plan. However, they seem displeased with how this development has panned out. We have with us Prashant again. So, Prashant, can you tell us what's happening in Iraq?
Right. So this is kind of the natural conclusion of the past few months, in the sense that Moqtada al Sadr, the elections were held in October 2021 in Iraq. Moqtada al Sadr's bloc emerged as the single largest bloc. There was a possibility that they could form the government. But what happened in the intervening months is that al Sadr's attempt to form the government did not really work out, because he was also very keen on a kind of majority-based government as opposed to a consensus government, which would have left, say, other Shia parties in the opposition, for instance. And that was what he was looking at, but he was not able to really bring together the right coalition to be able to do that. Now, once that kind of an impasse was reached, al Sadr took this strange decision, according to many, of deciding to quit parliament, in the sense that he asked his supporters to resign. His supporters resigned. Now, it's unclear whether this was a bluff, in the sense that he hoped that the resignations would not be accepted. That is what it looks like if you listen to observers like Rania Khalek, for instance. But it looks like that's one possibility, that it may have been a bluff. But the bluff was called and the resignations were accepted. So basically, al Sadr's supporters who came to parliament, who were hoping, for instance, to share state power, kind of ended up in a difficult position where, and Moqtada al Sadr also ended up in that position, where suddenly, from being in a position where they were the single largest bloc, to being kind of outside the political spectrum. And now, once that happened, the onus next shifted on what is called the coordination framework, a set of other Shia parties which are even slightly more closer to Iran. Now, important to remember that al Sadr is also a Shia cleric. He also has ties with the Iranians. Now, everyone has ties with all the countries, so it's not exactly right to see it as because the Emiratis are also involved, for instance. But the important thing here is that the coordination framework now has the chance of forming the government. Now, it's important to remember that Iraq has a particular confessional system, which means that each position is is reserved for a particular category. For instance, the Kurds have the president's position, the Sunnis have the speaker of the parliament's position, and the prime minister is always a Shia. Right. So now the coordination framework has the possibility of forming the government with the prime minister. Now, al Sadr and his supporters really basically have been cut out of the whole process. And they are right now in a position where their legitimacy is suddenly in question, because now if they had state power, for instance, it is different, but without state power, they are not in a position to sort of influence much. So what they're trying to do at this point is to sort of cause a bit of say chaos, cause a bit of that's what it looks like, at least cause a bit of unrest, so that and try to shake up the system, so that they tried this, they find a way in, they find a way back into the game again, which is really what they kind of lost out of. So that's to summarize a very complex situation. That's pretty much what is happening right now.
And like you mentioned, the involvement of other countries from the region, what can be the regional impact of this?
So yes, of course. So this takes place at a very interesting time in West Asia, because on the one hand, we know that the United States and Israel are pushing a very strong anti-Iran line, so to speak. But this is also at a time when traditional US allies in the region, such as the Emiratis, Saudi Arabia, are also doing their own process with Iran of negotiations, of discussions. This is taking place in the context of the Houthis in the war in Yemen, for instance. And Iraq is actually a key battleground, so to speak, for many of these interests. So it's these interests which sort of work together, various countries' interests working together in support of various blocs. So there are, for instance, politicians who are identified as closely associated with one country or the other, and this is in the context in which, in fact, Al Sadr's own also had an equation with the Emiratis, which he kind of feels he has been betrayed by them due to this whole process of where he lost his resignation, the resignations were accepted and all that. So that's a key. That's a larger picture, but it's important also that Iraq is also important that way, because any larger instability in Iraq could actually affect many of these processes that are going on. And that way, it's kind of very important that these relations actually sort of continue to stabilize Iraq, and it keeps going like that. Because on the one hand, for instance, I'll give you a good example. For instance, Mustafa al-Kadhimi, who's the caretaker prime minister now, has close ties with both Iran and the United States, which is, which actually, if you think about it, it seems quite strange, but that's really how it is. In fact, I believe the United States would like al-Kadhimi to want him to actually continue as the prime minister, but he really doesn't have that kind of support. So there are a lot of processes going on in the region, and a lot of players involved in it, which is what is leading to also many of these negotiations right now. But right now, it seems that the coordination framework has an advantage. But whether they'll be able to keep it or not is really the question, because a president has to be elected next, and after that, it's only after that so it's going to take many months. It may take a couple of months at least. And during this period of time, Al Sadr is going to definitely try and do his best to sort of shake up the system, so that the process is not as easy as it seems, and that, say, all parties may step back and try to think in terms of how his interests can be accommodated as much as possible. Now, also important to note that Al Sadr's own power has slightly come down a bit after the protests of 2019, the wave of protests that happened. But nonetheless, he retains considerable street power, and that has always been one of his most strongest aspects. So what it looks like, what he's trying to do is to sort of give a signal that he has the ability to bring people. And it's important, the location also in Green Zone in Baghdad, which has been the traditional, is a very strongly is a secure area, entering parliament itself. So he's also giving a signal to the other players that he's very much there, and he really can't be ignored, even if his members of parliament members are no longer in power.
Thank you, Prashant, and do stay on for the next story as well. The US has recorded negative growth for the second quarter in a row, sparking fears of a recession. While the US calculates recession by different metrics, concern is arising over the way to handle it even as inflation is high. Prashant, can you tell us what's the large numbers that are coming in right now?
Right. So as you said, it's the second quarter in a row that the US has recorded negative growth. I think this is 0.9% or something. Now, important thing to note that along with that, as analysts and journalists in the US have pointed out, including our friend Eugene Purrier, a lot of this is also, for instance, if you look at the statements of big banks, it shows that many of them have recorded, the profits have actually come down for many of these big banks, which is a good metric to measure that as well. And the US, like you said, does not necessarily calculate recession in those terms. In many other countries, negative growth for 2 quarters is often categorized as a recession. It's called technically recession. The US might sort of, US officials on the other hand have been sort of saying that no, I mean, for instance, unemployment is not very high, the job market is still strong. So keeping all these things in mind, they're not willing to call it a recession yet. So that's one aspect of it. Now, the other aspect, of course, is inflation, which you mentioned as well, which is at quite a high number. It's around over 9%, I believe it was recorded in June. And this is a very worrying sign for large parts of the economy as well, because inflation is one of those aspects. In fact, I think recent polling has said that the economy and inflation are top on the minds of many American citizens, many American voters. So coming in as the October midterm elections mount, it's something they're very, the government is really very worried about it and wants to stop. So we have a situation where there's negative growth as well as high inflation, and that's what is often called stagflation is an example of that. So we have a very difficult situation as far as the U.S. economy is concerned. Many economies in the world, of course, facing very similar situations, but in the United States, of course, because of its size, because of the influence it has on the world economy, also extremely difficult situation for them. Now, important to note, of course, that this has also been marked by a time of, on the other hand, so we talked about how banks' profits have decreased, but there are also certain other companies which are marking record profits. And even when we talk about bank profits, it's important to remember that these are based on last year's number. I mean, the current numbers are compared to last year's, and last year was a record number for record. It was a record in terms of profits made by many of these institutions. So that factor has to be remembered. And the important thing is that a lot of corporates are nonetheless making considerable profits, even as, for instance, there's a recession or even as prices are very high. So that's one very important thing to remember, because the general understanding about inflation that the say conventional economists have been sort of saying is basically that the COVID-19 relief that was given to the people led to a large amount of purchasing, and therefore there were shortages, which is why there's inflation, whereas actually that's not really the case.
Okay, and since we were talking about inflation earlier, how does the US plan to tackle the inflation?
So this is a very important aspect. There are two aspects to this. One is that the Federal Reserve plans to control inflation by increasing what is called the interest rate. When you do that, what happens basically, and the latest was announced on Wednesday, if I'm not mistaken. And when you do that, what happens is that it becomes more difficult to borrow. And so the credit system gets squeezed a bit, which basically means that the economy overall slows down, because so much of our economy is based on borrowing, right? And so basically companies companies are hesitant to borrow, which means that they try to cut costs. When they try to cut costs, they lay off people, economic activity slows down, and accordingly inflation also slows down. So that's often the method used to control inflation in many countries. Now the problem with this, of course, is that it kind of miscalculates the reason for inflation in the United States, which, and a recent very important study has pointed that out, or that of say $1 of inflation that takes place, 54 cents are due to corporate price rises or corporate profits, what is called price gouging. So what we've seen in recent times is that corporates are increasing prices and making a huge amount of money out of that. So if you look at the total inflation, say $1 worth of inflation, about 54 cents are because of corporate price rises, about 30% is due to supply chain issues, and the rest is maybe due to wages, etc. So, and even if you look at supply chain issues, a lot of these supply chain issues often take place because, again, corporates spend in such a way that they do not invest in supply chains. They try to keep it, they spend the least amount of money on that as possible. So when a crisis like COVID-19, for instance, takes place, then the supply chain is hit massively. So what we've seen is basically that this economic crisis is very horrible for the people, for instance, who are facing huge amounts of inflation, but the corporates are having a great time. But the strategy to combat inflation basically involves a strategy whereby actually working people will suffer the most, because they're the ones who are going to lose jobs when economic activity sort of subsides or begins to slow down. Whereas if you, for instance, opt for something like a tax on corporates, what that does is actually target those who are benefiting, right, from this, rather than the people who are going to suffer from this. So, but on the other hand, that's not really on the paper. There is a new budget proposal that is out which talks about some kind of corporate taxes, but they don't really increase taxes as much as cut, say close some loopholes. And that still will not ensure that the actual tax that corporates owe is paid, because there are so many loopholes, so many ways of actually getting past paying what has to be paid. So keeping all this in mind, it's a very, but there seems to be no different school of thought in the US policy establishment, no notion that you should bite the bullet and actually tax these corporates. Instead, what the only option seems to be they seem to believe in is to increase interest rates, which is what both the Republicans and the Democrats believe in. So keeping this in mind, there doesn't seem to be much good news lying ahead for the working people, the poor in the United States. Whereas it seems that for corporates there is a it's not I don't know if the recession itself is going to affect them so badly. Of course, they will suffer a bit, but like I said, we're also talking about a time of great profits for them where they're riding on this inflationary wave.
Thank you so much, Prashant, for being with us on the show today. And that's all we have for today's episode. For more such stories and updates from around the globe, keep following peoplesdispatch.org and also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.